Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Prukalpa Sankar about Atlan, a modern data workspace that makes collaboration among data stakeholders easier, increasing efficiency and agility in data projects. So, Prukalpa, can you start by introducing yourself?
Thanks for having me. My name is Prukalpa. I'm one of the founders of Atlan. I've been a data practitioner my whole life. Prior to this, built and ran the data teams that built India's national data platform, which is one of the largest public sector data lakes of its kind. Really learned all of the challenges with building and running data teams firsthand. And a lot of those learnings and failures is what led to Atlan today.
And do you remember how you first got involved in the area of data management?
So I've been a data practitioner my whole life. My co-founder, Varun, and I actually met in university. And what started out as a passion project turned into something more than that. We said, hey, large-scale problems like national level healthcare and poverty alleviation, they don't use data and it feels like they should. Let's go do something about that. And bit by bit, we ended up building a world-leading data for good organization. We were a World Economic Forum tech pioneer. We were doing a lot of work with folks like the United Nations and the Gates Foundation and several large governments. And, I think just became a data practitioner by teaching ourselves ways to solve these important problems that we cared about. And data management was the biggest challenge that we had in every one of the projects that we implemented. So very organic journey.
As you mentioned, some of the lessons that you brought into Atlan were learned in the process of building out the data platform for India. And I'm wondering if you can just start by giving a bit of an overview about what it is that you have built at Atlan and some of the story behind deciding to turn it into a business and some of the core principles that you wanted to be able to address as you were building out the product.
So the two-liner in Atlan, we sort of see ourselves as a collaborative workspace for a modern data team. So what a GitHub is for an engineering team or a Figma is for a design team, knowing fully well how diverse a modern data team is, right? Analysts, engineers, scientists, business, all with their own tooling preferences and skill sets. How do you sort of enable this team to work together most effectively? So we sort of see ourselves as that glue that binds the people together with the tools and technology. I think what's useful is, how we got started, right? We actually started out as a data team ourselves. We were, as I was saying, doing a lot of work in the data science for social good space, but, working with a wide variety and scale of data, right? From billions of pixels of satellite imagery to processing data for over 500 million Indian citizens. And while many of these are dream projects for a data practitioner, the reality for us every day was that every day was chaos. Our Slack channels would be filled with messages like, what does this column name mean? Or can I use this final cleaned version of this data set? I still remember this one time where one of the cabinet ministers of India called me at 8 a.m. and he said, Prukalpa, the number on this dashboard doesn't look right. And then I go like, okay, I open up my laptop. There's a 2x spike in a day. So clearly it was wrong. But there was nothing I could do at that point, right? So I said, sir, I'll call you back. And then I called my project manager, who called my analyst, who called my engineer, who pulled out audit logs, but he couldn't troubleshoot it because he didn't know what the variables meant. Long story short, we were spending 50-60% of our time dealing with issues like this. And if you think about these challenges, they're not as much technology problems as much as they are human collaboration problems. We actually sort of got to this point where we realized we couldn't continue to scale like this. And so started an internal project to make our team more agile and effective over time. So over a couple of years, built tooling that made us about 6 times more agile. That was actually why we went on to do things like build India's national data platform, which is awesome because the Prime Minister uses it. But what was really cool was that it was built by an 8-member team, start to finish in 12 months, which is one of the fastest of its kind globally. And sort of realized we'd end up building some tooling that might help other data teams around the world. I was really with that question that, Atlan was born. We were like, hey, can these tools that made our data team do these things that we thought would be impossible to accomplish? Can we help every data team in the world be a little bit more efficient, a little bit more agile? And what could that do, I guess, to the broader world, right? So that's actually how we started.
So you mentioned that Atlan is built as this focal point for data teams, and I'm wondering if you can just give a bit of an example of sort of who the target users of Atlan are and just some of the ways that it might fit into their existing workflows, or if there's any sort of change in the way that they approach their work and the problems that they're trying to solve that Atlan provides.
Typical users of Atlan tend to be anyone who's a data user in an organization, right? So obviously the core data team, this could be the analysts, the data engineers, the scientists. But increasingly, we're also living in this world where everyone is an analyst in some ways, right? So increasingly, you're seeing adoption in what is being called the citizen data scientists or the power data users inside an organization in the business as well. As you think about the workflow, I think it would be useful to take a step back and just talk about some of the fundamental principles behind the product at Atlan. So the product itself is built on like three fundamental principles. The first is this principle that we call a data asset. Now, traditionally, a data asset would be just a table or a database, right? But if you think about in today's world, a model is an asset, a BI dashboard is an asset, code is an asset, pipelines are an asset. So what we've tried to sort of build is this concept of what does it mean to be a data asset and how can you treat and maintain a data asset the way it should be. Around every data asset, we have this concept that we call a data asset profile. The best analogy to think about this is a GitHub code repo, right? So when you're onboarding an engineer on a team, you just share a link to a GitHub code repo. It has your code, your documentation, your revisions, everything that an engineer needs to actually just get started to work. But if you think about it, when it comes to data, it's really hard to get down to that single source of truth. And that's also because the single source of truth in the data ecosystem is spread across a couple of different places, right? So, the truth about who else is using this data is in the BI tool. The truth about where is this data coming from is in the ETL tool. And so what we've tried to do is say, how can we create the single source of truth in this asset profile that makes it, possible for an end user to understand everything that they need to know about the data asset and trust it, knowing that the truth itself is going to be dispersed in a couple of different places, right? And finally, we've tried to create this concept of what we call embedded collaboration, right? Which is once you've come in and discovered your data asset and understood everything you need to know about it, how do you start using it, right? And we think about this as almost microflows. So right from things like, why can't you share a data asset as simple as sharing a link on Google Docs, right? Or when you request access to a data asset, why can't you just let an owner get a request on Slack who should just be able to approve it? Or how do you just quickly open up that link in a Tableau or a Jupyter? So what that means for our end users, if you think about these three principles, is that, fundamentally we end up becoming a layer on top of their existing data stack. So typically, our customers have implemented the best tools in the modern data stack, right? So a Snowflake or a Redshift or a Databricks, they have an existing BI tool like a Looker or a Sisense or a Tableau in place. They're using dbt. Typically that's the workflow of a typical team that brings in Atlan. And we basically become like a search, discovery, virtual hub layer across all of these tools in their ecosystem. So the first step for a user is you don't need to message someone on Slack and say, hey, which data set did we use in this project, or can I trust this, or essentially we replace that ad hoc flows that are happening inside an org and essentially just bring what an ideal 21st century world experience of collaboration should look like on these data assets.
In terms of the components of the data stack, I'm wondering, for somebody who has an existing data platform, they've got their workflows established, they're feeling the pain that most data teams are as far as not understanding, okay, what are some of the lineage systems, or what was the use case, or what's the context around these data assets? There are different systems that are being built out to be able to address some of those. I'm thinking in terms of metadata management tools, so things like Data Hub or Datakin. There are data catalogs, there are access control layers, such as things like Immuta or Apache Atlas. And it sounds like Atlan is either trying to integrate with or supplement or supplant some of those systems. So I'm wondering sort of how does Atlan fit within the broader ecosystem of data tools that people might already be using, and what are the pieces that might be replaced wholesale by Atlan?
At Atlan, we love open source. We're built on open source. The entire product is built on like a fully open API architecture. And, the problem we're trying to solve is like, we actually fundamentally believe a lot of the fundamental technology infrastructure layer challenges are going to be solved in the open source ecosystem or the managed cloud ecosystem. And so, our goal is really to say, how do you solve the human collaboration problem? How do you create a product experience that users love, that users want to sort of use on a daily basis and can get up and running in like 30 minutes, right? And so what that means from a core capabilities perspective is that, Atlan basically becomes people use a lot of different words in the industry these days, but like your data discovery, data cataloging, data governance, observability sort of layer as that sort of virtual layer on top of all of your data assets. Behind the scenes, again, we leverage the best of open source, and we've built sort of a super easy to set up, 30-minute setup, and a lot of automation layers, right? So for example, we go into things like Snowflake and, we parse through your SQL query history and we auto-construct column level lineage across your data ecosystem. We have a bunch of bots that read through your columns and actually suggest column descriptions and linkages in all of your data ecosystem. So a bunch of those automatic aspects that actually make projects like this super difficult. Fundamentally, Atlan itself gets adopted in orgs that are building out a modern data platform, just like you said, right? So typically we don't end up replacing any older tech. We're typically greenfield. It's typically the ideal team for Atlan is somebody who's looking to bring in a full-fledged end-to-end solution in that metadata management layer broadly and wants to get started in 30 minutes and actually just get down to work. So I think that's sort of where we would fit in. But I think all in all, the category itself is still super nascent and still developing, right? Truly believe that the right solution in this space is going to look much closer to what a GitHub does in engineering or a Figma in design than any tool that exists today in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so the sort of metadata layer, as you said, is still evolving. There are a number of different players who are trying to carve out their own niche where I'm thinking in terms of like data governance and metadata, there's Data Hub in terms of being able to catalog your assets and understand some of the data flows. Datakin is very focused with the sort of Marquez open source core of it on understanding the lineage aspects. And then there are things like Immuta and Apache Atlas that are very focused on access control and sort of security controls, managing PII. And it seems that Atlan is trying to make more of a broad platform play that covers all of those different aspects. And then, also going into data quality, there's an explosion of companies that are trying to address different forms of that. And so for somebody who is building out a new platform, they say, okay, I've got my workflow management system, so I might be using a Dagster or an Airflow. I've got my data lake where I'm using S3 and Trino, or maybe I've got everything landing in Snowflake. Then they're saying, okay, now I need to be able to see what are all the flows across this. Would they also be using some of those other tools like Soda and Databand for the observability aspects, and then plug that into Atlan for visibility, and using Data Hub for the metadata management that then has a layer in Atlan that they view? Or would Atlan replace the choice of bringing in those tools?
Maybe I'll help you understand sort of behind the scenes, the open source that we integrate with, right? And I think that'll help you. So behind the scenes, Atlan, we leverage Apache Atlas for essentially the metadata management layer, Apache Ranger from a security perspective. We integrate into ecosystems like Great Expectations from a data quality perspective. So fundamentally, what we've tried to do is sort of take some of these fundamental open source projects, build a layer on top of that makes it super DIY for ecosystems like Snowflake, Trino, Airflow. So we have a native plugin into Airflow. So 30-minute setup on top of all of that. What that means typically is we would integrate very well into, for example, if it's in a Snowflake, a Trino, all of the fundamental data warehouses, lakes, orchestration tools are all native integrations that we've built with, that Atlan comes with. We would end up typically replacing a discovery solution like a data hub. I mean, mostly customers, actually it's a choice, right? You choose between like, do you want to take open source and build on top of it, or do you want to just go with like a managed approach? So it typically ends up being that choice, for customers. And I think there are different teams that have different approaches based on the resources they're ready to sort of invest into building on top of some of this. So one of those ends up being this sort of ecosystem. So basically where the layer that Atlan would come in on is your metadata management, data discovery, data lineage, and aspects of access control. Those are the places that Atlan becomes really, really valuable as a full-fledged solution. We would integrate into ecosystems like an Immuta or a Privacera from a policy enforcement perspective. So policy enforcement is something that we don't do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's definitely very useful context and useful framing because, as you said, it can be very nebulous, sort of what are the dividing lines between all of these different systems. And a lot of times there's some slight overlap where you say, okay, there's a little bit of overlap between these two tools, but I need both of them because of their core capabilities. And so understanding sort of like where do all these different layers tie together? There's never very clear dividing lines because everybody starts with some core capability and then kind of expands out to the neighboring areas. And so as far as the sort of specific data assets, you mentioned that there are some different ways of thinking about it. So it could be that there's a table in your data warehouse. It could be that there's a machine learning model that you've got deployed to production, the code repository for managing the workflows. How do you think about the assets and what are some of the variations in terms of what type of information you need to be able to track for them and how you represent that within Atlan for being able to unify in a sort of single pane of glass how they all relate to each other?
So we fundamentally think about every data asset as its own unique entity, right? So a table is its own unique entity, which is different from a BI dashboard, which is different from a BI widget, which is very different from code. So we think of these as very different, unique data assets and data asset entities. And as we think about the ideal profile, right, like the guiding light for us is like, what does it take to create a single source of truth? And that always starts at the user, right? Like, so if you're looking at a table, what is all the information that would create the single source of truth for that data asset? So every data asset has its own unique type of profile in Atlan. And I think that's the first layer, right? Like, what does the ideal data asset profile look like? And, we actually open up data assets asset by asset, right? So we want to make sure that, so our approach on this has been, a couple of different layers, right? One, how do you create the ideal profile? Second, how do you create all the integrations that it takes to fill up that profile with the single source of truth with as little human intervention as possible? We've taken a very DIY approach, a core philosophy for us is that you should not need engineering involvement to set up something like an Atlan. And this is a core philosophy for us because, when we were a data team ourselves, our engineering resources were the most scarce resources we had, right? Like engineering time is so valuable. So you need to be really, really careful about what you're investing that engineering time in. And so one of our core principles has been that, in an ideal case, you shouldn't need a data engineer's time to actually set up something like an Atlan. And so that means that we invest in going really deep into our integrations, right? So it's fully, UI driven, 30-minute setup. We try and make it possible that even an analyst can set up Atlan, internally. And so that means basically saying different things for different tooling, right? So if, say, you're picking Snowflake, it means, going super deep into all of the integrations and the, how do you make that DIY? But when you're looking at a table, you probably also want information coming in from your ETL, from Airflow, right? And saying, what does freshness look like for this data asset? Or when was the last time the DAG run, right? And so that's where a lot of the extensibility and the plugins in Atlan come in. So we have a native plugin into Airflow to allow sort of that information to just be directly pushed in via the API, try to keep it super customizable and extensible. So that's really the second layer. And the third layer is the relationship layer, like you talked about, right? Now, what is this table linked to? For example, what BI dashboards does this table power? And that's really where elements of lineage, but also other relationships in your ecosystem come in. Again, there we've taken the approach of depth versus breadth. For example, I talked about this with Snowflake, but with any SQL ecosystem, we basically parse through your SQL query history, we look through your logs, and again, through native integrations, we're able to say, this Looker dashboard is powered by exactly this table and this column in your ecosystem. And then a bunch of bots on that layer, right? So this is where a lot of the intelligence of Atlan starts kicking in. So if you know that only your top 20% data assets are being used and queried, how does that go into the search algorithm? How do you basically link, if you have a business term like annual recurring revenue, how do you know all of the columns that are linked to it without needing a human to sort of create that layer yourself? So those are the layers that we've tried to build, again, to make sure that it's not just setup, but it's also time to value that becomes as efficient and with the least amount of human intervention possible.
And so digging a bit more into the Atlan platform itself, can you talk through some of the architectural core of it and some of the ways that it's implemented and just some of the overall evolution and shift in terms of the design and the broad goals of the platform since you first began working on it?
Yeah, so I touch on this. It's a fully open architecture, built on a fully open API kind of ecosystem. Atlan's built on a Kubernetes cluster, so lots of auto scaling and elements like that are baked in. We offer the product in two ways. So one is as a deployed solution on a customer's virtual private cloud. So this, for example, on AWS is a CloudFormation template. Essentially, again, like the intent has been to make it like a one-click deployment process. And then it's powered by a whole ton of things like Grafana dashboards and things like that make engineering management super, super easy. The other is sort of as a managed SaaS kind of offering, in which case we take care of all of the management of the product itself. So the first step is, of course, just setting up the product and the architecture, which is relatively straightforward, typically a one-click process. The second aspect of implementation is connecting into your data sources. So this could be typically your data lakes, your warehouses, your databases, your BI tools, for example. These are very DIY kind of integrations that are built into Atlan. So it's a fully UI-driven, just come in, add in your credentials, set up a scheduler, and say, I want to run this, in this frequency or pieces like that. So we've taken away any of the management aspects of setting up and bringing your data assets into Atlan, and a lot of monitoring elements. I think the thing that people actually miss out a lot, it's actually not that hard to set things up the first time. When things really break is when things break, right? So the amount of data engineering time that gets spent troubleshooting something that you set up is far more than the time you spend setting something up, right? So again, a lot of pieces, we've tried to make that super UI driven. So, lots of monitoring, Slack alerts, just things like that just allow you to know if things are working the way they should and, ideally prevent them from going wrong before they do. So that's the second aspect. So typically customers actually get up and running with Atlan in 1 hour, maybe, worst case 24 to 48 hours if you need credentials from your security team. So it's a pretty easy setup process. And then from there, of course, there's there are elements of how do you want to organize your data assets in Atlan, right? And some of those principles of how you want to set up Atlan for your own workspace or your own organization. But those tend to be more human-driven aspects that kick in.
RudderStack's smart customer data pipeline is warehouse first. It builds your customer data warehouse and your identity graph on your data warehouse with support for Snowflake, Google BigQuery, Amazon Redshift, and more. Their SDKs and plugins make event streaming easy, and their integrations with cloud applications like Salesforce and Zendesk help you go beyond event streaming. With RudderStack, you can use all of your customer data to answer more difficult questions and send those insights to your whole customer data stack. Sign up for free at dataengineeringpodcast.com/rudder today. And you mentioned that a lot of the core of Atlan is built on top of different open source capabilities. I'm wondering what were some of the main systems that helped you get to where you are today, and what were the pieces that you saw as missing in the broader open source community that you decided you needed to rebuild from scratch, either because there was a solution that was adjacent to what you were trying to build and it wasn't quite sufficient, or there just wasn't anything that was available that sort of met the needs of what you were trying to build?
I think some of the fundamental components have been great. Atlas, Ranger, for example. I think we had to modernize these tools a little bit, right? Because they were fundamentally built in the Hadoop era, right? So they don't natively come with out-of-the-box support for a lot of the modern data stack tooling. But if you actually think about the fundamental open source ecosystem, I think they're still far ahead of almost anything else that we see in the open source ecosystem right now. So I think those were actually some really good engineering technology choices that we made. Also because we started building Atlan for ourselves, right? So we didn't want to rebuild anything that exists in the ecosystem, almost use engineering resources only to solve real problems, not to rebuild something that exists. So obviously I think one piece was just definitely modernizing and building, essentially making a lot of these fundamental platforms compatible with what is the modern data stack. I think that's where we invested a lot of energy. The other, I think from a quality perspective, so Atlan does automated data quality profiling and pieces like that. I think there we've actually tried to, I think that's where the open architecture helps a lot. Because one of the things we've realized is that the reality of the fundamental technology infrastructure layer in the data ecosystem is it's going to continue to evolve really, really quickly, right? So for example, we used to use DQ, open source by Amazon as a data quality framework, but then, had been watching Great Expectations for a while. And, I think they've done a fantastic job with being able to sort of drive, high quality profiling at much lower cost. So within a month, we swapped out sort of DQ with Great Expectations. That meant 75% savings on profiling for our end customers. And so again, there, we've tried to keep the ecosystem very, very open. We contribute back to all of these open source communities. And again, the approach here has been, we want to solve for the end human experience layer. And as much as possible behind the scenes, we've kept the architecture super open because we actually think that there will continue to be a lot more innovation in the open source ecosystem, right? What's right for our end customers, which are data teams, is that they should not be locked in to an individual technology choice or an architecture choice. I think that's really where I think, the open architecture has helped a lot.
In terms of some of the early assumptions that you had as you were starting to build out this system for your own use cases and then began realizing that there was the opportunity for building a business around it, what were some of the ideas or assumptions that you had going into it that have been challenged or invalidated as you continued to build out the platform and bring on customers and learn more about some of the various ways that people are approaching their data problems?
The interesting story is we actually tried building a tool like Atlan for ourselves 3 times and we failed. And it was only the 4th time that we got it right. And so lots and lots of learnings to share about, just early assumptions. And I think the way to think about sort of tooling in this category. I think the first and the most early assumption that we made, and I think this is a very easy one to do as technologists, right, is to go after the hardest technology problem to solve. Because as a technologist, the most exciting problem to solve in a lot of ways, right? So I remember the first time we, started an internal project to solve for the problems Atlan's solving. We basically ended up building, I think, one of our most, even till date, technically advanced systems. So it literally had NLP-based search engine. If you search for something like schools in Bangalore with, 10 toilets or, things like that. You would literally get only the list of rows for the question that you're searching for. I think, graph-based ecosystem, we did all of this technology innovation with the product. And I think what we ended up realizing, and I think this is a constant reminder until date, I keep reminding, both ourselves and the team, is that this wasn't a technology problem as much as it was a human problem. Things like search, for example, have actually been commoditized in some ways, right? With Elasticsearch and Algolia. The challenge isn't really there. The challenge is how do you actually add the context that actually add relevance into sort of your search engines and pieces like that. And that context is always going to lie with humans. Now, if you think about the data ecosystem, the beautiful thing about data as a practice is that it lies as an intersection between business, which is fundamentally human-driven, and technology. And so all of the context that lies with an individual data practitioner about users and entities and business, that is the context that is going to power an amazing, sort of search and relevancy and all of those things that come with an amazing metadata management layer, right? And so we ended up then, rebuilding a couple of times. We actually tried to buy a solution, which is a very funny story for another time. And we failed at that miserably. Then we built out actually an internal hacky tool, which I think was semi-successful, but we never got users to use it on a daily basis. And I think this is the part that people miss, right? Airbnb talked about this, I think, in the blog announcing their internal data portal. They talked about this concept of, design can never be an afterthought when you are designing a data platform. And this is so true because to make context real. Context is a team sport. The context about the business use case of the data assets is going to lie with the business user. The context about the technical pieces is going to be with the data engineer. Business user, data engineer, fundamentally different people, right? Like data engineer just wants to like sort of use APIs to push whatever information they have. Business user wants like a super easy sort of Dropbox paper like experience to add in their context. Like very, very different people. But without both people loving the product, there's no way you're going to get shared context. And so I think the last time, and I think this was the time that we were successful, and that laid the foundation of Atlan today. We actually started the other way around. We started with the user interface and prototypes. So we would basically run these analyst anonymous sessions in our own team. We would call the team together. They would talk about their problems. We would basically literally mock flows and say, is this flow going to work for you? And then the data engineer would say something about, I'm never going to use that. And so we sort of started like building like flows for each and every one of our personas internally, right? Like what would make an analyst use this on a daily basis? What would make a data engineer use this on a daily basis? And we actually built from there. And I think that was ultimately the time that we were successful. And so I think, the early assumptions of this being a, really hard tech problem to solve, I think, this is just a human collaboration problem. How do you help these very, very diverse humans come together and solve problems together?
Digging more into the sort of business and process aspects of how people are using Atlan and the problems that Atlan solves for, what are some of the organizational practices and organizational processes that can and should be put in place to help people gain the most value from systems like Atlan and being able to have a single place to look at for all of the different assets that they're using and the data flows and just some of the education that's necessary for being able to onboard all of the different user profiles into something like Atlan?
Again, great question. And I think something that people actually overlook a lot, which is, if you believe that this is a human collaboration problem, then this is a lot more to do with culture than, technology and great products are just going to help you, drive a culture, right? But I think the starting point is really going to have to come from the team. So something that we typically recommend is, making sure that the team really is bought in to the fact that this is a problem that the team wants to solve for. Right? And I think that's really the first step. And the reality is that, sometimes it might not be the highest priority problem. So for example, I've spoken to sometimes 3 or 4 member data teams who are still setting up their BI tools and their BI reports and their dashboards, right? And I think at that point, if you have 20 tables and, you're working with 4 teammates, it's not that big of a challenge. What we've seen is that typically the minute you get past 100 data assets, maybe more than that, you start hitting the 500 data assets mark, your data team started growing, you're working with a large number of business stakeholders. That's when the problem becomes real and becomes real very, very quickly, because there's this tipping point that I call where, the time you put a new data practitioner onto the team and the team is not producing more outcomes as a result of the extra member on the team, right? And a lot of that comes down to context and, overheads and pieces like that. So I think the first step is just making sure that the team is completely bought into the problem. And so, for example, something that we recommend to our customers is, and we would do this ourselves as a team, we would do these start, stop, continue sessions, which is, every quarter we would, as a team, say, what are we doing really well? What should we stop doing? What should we do better? What should we continue doing? And, typically come down to 2 or 3 priorities that we agree to as a team, that these are the top 2 or 3 priorities we want to solve for. And there's going to be a time when problems like this become a reality for the team. And when it does, that's when you start looking for a solution. Not before that, not after that, but at that exact point. I think from there, I think it really comes down to the approach of how you want to solve this problem, right? I think, do you want to go the open source route and essentially invest in engineering resources? Do you have that kind of engineering resource that it's going to take? All of those questions, do you want to just buy off the shelf? There's all those questions that you have to answer, but I think that's the relatively easier part of the puzzle. And the final part is, once you bring in a tool, how do you actually start driving adoption? I think it's definitely important in the initial part of setting up a product like Atlan or any other tool in this ecosystem to ensure that you have someone who's driving it. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and we've been thinking about this concept of a data ops manager who's actually slightly closer to like a sales ops manager than a DevOps manager in some ways, right? So if you think about, actually learnings from ecosystems like sales where CRMs are real, like in some ways, like, data teams need a CRM. And that's, I think, where like sort of a role like that is important. It doesn't need to be a full-time position. It can just be somebody in the team who takes it on as an additional responsibility. But I think it's really important to have a directly responsible individual. Ideally, somebody who has had, who's been there long enough and has enough context about, the overall functioning of the data team and all of the context of different business units and, things like that. So I would definitely recommend making sure that there's someone on the team who can dedicate time in the first couple of months, which is basically what you're trying to do is like, you have this context in Confluence and you have this context in, your Airflow pipelines and all of these different places, and you're trying to bring it in and make sure you create that single source of truth in some ways. I think that's where it's heavy. I think from there, we've seen adoption kick off. If you invest in the right tooling, you don't, and users love it, you don't need to, put in significant effort beyond the initial setup. And the question we try to ask is like, for 80% of the data assets that your users are looking for, if they come on the platform, will they find the single source of truth? If they do, maybe not 100% of the single source, even if like they find 80% of their single source of truth, I think that's fine. And so as long as that sort of problem gets answered or that question gets answered in your setup phase, then there are ways to implement this as a part of your sprints. There's a way of implementing this as a part of your sort of day-to-day data culture.
Yeah, I really like the idea of having somebody who's sort of the internal salesperson to the rest of the organization to help them understand what is the pain point that they're feeling, and this is actually the solution for it that they sort of weren't able to put a name to yet, and then helping to sort of evangelize for the work that's being done by the data team and help to provide it as a solution and sort of treat the rest of the organization as a customer. Which is something that engineers are often encouraged to do, but often sort of lack the either motivation or capabilities to do because they're sort of heads down on building all the technical aspects.
Yeah, so I think the ideal person in a role like that is typically someone who's maybe been an analyst but wants to move to the product side, or someone who has great communication skills, understands data deeply, and has been in the shoes of the user. I think typically folks like that tend to be great fits in roles like this that we've seen. I think increasingly, like if you think about a sales team, they have like the sales ops manager who's responsible for maintaining Salesforce and maintaining like Looker dashboards on top of it and making sure that like, there's hygiene across the team, right? And so as our data stack continues to evolve, I think, every team is going to use like 5 or 6 tools at the least. Teams are going to get larger. It's important. Like someone needs to be managing the sprints. There's an element of that person could create a lot of leverage for the rest of the data organization if brought into the team at the right time. Probably, I would say at the time that you're like, maybe like 10-member data team, I think that's when it's like a good sweet spot to bring on someone like that. Yeah, I've increasingly been thinking about, like we've always had actually people ad hoc who've played that role. I think there was never really a career path or a designation or any of that. So been thinking about what that would mean for the broader data ecosystem and how to create more and more evangelists, I guess, for the data team in the larger organization.
Yeah, that plays into a conversation that I was having recently that I'm actually going to be doing another episode about soon, about sort of the continued segmentation of roles within the data ecosystem where, at the beginning it was, you had the data scientist and then you had the sort of BI engineer, and then the organizations realized that they actually need a data engineer to support the data scientist. ML ops came out as sort of a middle ground between the two, and now there's sort of data ops and data platform, and this continued fragmentation of roles and responsibilities as data continues to increase in the level of importance across such a wide variety of organizations.
There's actually this great book called Analyzing the Analyzers, which talks about this concept of actually, if you think about like a data scientist, like what is the true difference between like a data scientist and an analyst? And like there are like some skills here and there, but they're like, there are also overlaps. And so it talks about this concept of actually, looking at your skill sets across like 3 different axes in some ways, and the overlaps of those skill sets in some ways actually create the role that you fit most into in the org, and been thinking a lot about that. But I completely agree. It's nuts, right? I mean, like, it's ridiculous how many people call me and say, hey, we want to hire a data scientist in our team. And I'm like, okay, like, how big is your data org at this point? Unfortunately, they realize that actually they don't need a data scientist, they just need an analyst. But, I think there's just so much confusion and hype in the ecosystem that's been created. And so hopefully, I think, as an industry, we'll create more frameworks and standardization around some of these in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Or the common problem of, we need a data scientist, and okay, well, how many data engineers do you have to support them? The answer is none. And so in terms of Atlan, so somebody has decided, okay, this is what I need, I've got it set up. What are the steps to actually start using it as part of their day-to-day workflow? And as they continue to embed it in their broader data platform, what are the available extension points for being able to integrate new data sources, new sources of information about lineage and data quality? What are the available embedding points for bringing Atlan more fully into their existing systems?
So I'll answer the first question first, which is around adoption and integrating the product into like daily workflows. So we see this in 2 phases of implementation. The first is, we think of it as almost the enrichment phase, and this is to answer the question of 20% critical data assets in an organization across, like, there's a good 80-20 rule when it comes to data assets mostly. And then, on those 20% most useful, most used data assets, will you find a single source of truth for 80% of them on Atlan? This is where I think there's a little bit of heavy lifting for the human context layer that comes in, right? There's a bunch of things you can automate, like, for example, we do like frequency distribution so that someone doesn't need to write a column description. Like, there's a bunch of things you can do, but there is a human context layer to this, which is really critical. And I think that's where the initial enrichment, to make sure that the power users or the data analysts that have been around for the longest time, make sure that they take the time to sort of add that context into the product. That phase itself, it really depends. Like, it depends on how well set up the team is. Like, for example, like, we've had teams that just have such good documentation anyway that they end up like, setting up in like less than a week. And then, in some cases, if you have to like do all of this from scratch, there are ways to run sprints and things like that. But I think that's really the enrichment phase. And I think the phase from there is adoption. I know traditionally in this category, people have struggled with adoption. I think in our case, because we spent a whole bunch of time thinking through user experience, that's actually been a relatively easy phase for us. Atlan owns the sharing of a data asset. We have these simple things like, for example, Command K and advanced search allows you to like get to your most effective data asset in a couple of seconds instead of a couple of minutes. Or a Slack bot, so you can quickly just share a data asset directly into a Slack channel. So there are like these micro flows we've built in that help drive a lot of that adoption naturally inside an org. That's really the human aspect of adoption. The other is what I call the programmatic aspects of adoption, which is how do you integrate, again, because you sort of sit in the overarching layer or the metadata management layer across the data stack. It's really important that context should be integrated with all of the other tools. Because if you think about embedded collaboration, I talk about this all the time, if someone's in Looker and they're looking for what a column name means, they shouldn't have to come to Atlan. That should be available in Looker. And so that's really where the open API aspect of Atlan sort of kicks in. So we have a 2-way open API. So one aspect of it is, being able to take everything in Atlan and integrating it into the tools of choice. So this could be, a specific Jira workflow, or this could be a specific, BI tool that you want to add in context. And so I think that's one aspect of integrating deeply into the workflows. And the other is sending in information from internal tools, so quality frameworks, pipeline tools into Atlan. And I think that's where, so for example, we have teams that run these custom data quality checks, and they want to, in their data asset profile, enrich it with those custom data quality metrics that they're already computing. So I think that's the second part of bringing in all of your context from other ecosystems into Atlan.
Modern data teams are dealing with a lot of complexity in their data pipelines and analytical code. Monitoring data quality, tracing incidents, and testing changes can be daunting and often takes hours or days. Datafold helps data teams gain visibility and confidence in the quality of their analytical data through data profiling, column-level lineage, and intelligent anomaly detection. Datafold also helps automate regression testing of ETL code with its data diff feature that instantly shows how a change in ETL or BI code affects the produced data, both on a statistical level and down to individual rows and values. Datafold integrates with all major data warehouses, as well as frameworks such as Airflow and dbt, and seamlessly plugs into CI workflows. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datafold today to start a 30-day trial of Datafold. Once you sign up and create an alert in Datafold for your company data, they'll send you a cool water flask. As you have built out Atlan and used it internally and onboarded customers to the system, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen it used?
Yeah. Every day I'm amazed by the kinds of use cases that data teams start sort of using Atlan for. I think there's some, obviously the standard ones, right? Like data discovery and things like that. I'm not going to go into that. Some of my favorite ones, there was this data science team that actually started using Atlan as their data exploration layer, because their only other way of exploring their data assets ended up being spinning up a Spark cluster, setting up a Jupyter notebook, and writing some code to figure out like missing values and frequency distributions and things like that. So, very proud of being able to save them in their minds. Like they said, 50% of their time on data exploration. So one element is definitely that phase of, before you get started on a project, making sure you know everything you need to know about your data without human intervention. Other interesting one has been actually budget prioritization. This one was totally unexpected, but we act as that sort of layer on top of all of the data assets. We actually can tell what are your top used data assets and what are your most unused data assets. What are your tools that are being used the most vis-a-vis what's not. And interestingly, we've seen sort of teams use this as a way to prioritize and say, this table gets used only once a week. Why are we spending on a pipeline that updates this data every 15 minutes, right? So that's been an interesting one. A few others, there's a fintech startup that's using Atlan to actually propagate their confidentiality ratings across their ecosystem. I think that's an interesting one because if you have column level lineage automatically across your ecosystem, if you mark one column as confidential, technically you can have all the other columns inherit this, and that can basically become a way to drive access policies. So I think those would be the top interesting, unexpected ones. We're increasingly also seeing Atlan being rolled out as a part of a cloud data lake, cloud data warehouse initiative. What's become interesting is that I think increasingly people are realizing that the modern data stack is incomplete without sort of a overarching metadata solution. I think that's been an interesting one that we're seeing a lot more of.
In terms of your own experience of building the Atlan platform and growing the business around it, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
It keeps coming back to the same one, which is ensuring that you keep remembering, or at least for us, that our North Star is that this is a human collaboration and a human experience problem and not a fundamental technology infrastructure problem. It's always very easy as technologists to go into really complex technical problem. But, for example, the other day I was speaking to an analyst who was they're in BizOps, they get assigned to different business units all the time. Every time they do that, they basically have to fill out this long form that they send to IT to get access to data. And typically they have to say what data sets they have to get access to, which they don't know the exact name of. It then goes to a business owner who approves it. So 24 to 48 hours later, you get access to something. And most of the time, it's not even the data set that you requested for because you mostly are not even you don't even know what you're looking for in the first place. And that is a human problem. That is a problem between how do you help this analyst collaborate with IT and that business owner in a way that the minute he's assigned to, the ideal solution here should be the minute he's assigned to a different business to solve a different business problem, he should automatically be given rights to, the data assets that the business owner has access to, right? There are so many ways to think about solving this sort of collaboration problem. And I think we've just scratched the surface of what's possible there. So I think the challenging lesson has been to just remind ourselves constantly that to not go after the shiny problem, but go after the real user problem at the end of the day.
As a brief tangent on what you were just saying, as far as sort of gaining access to the different assets owned by the various business units, I'm starting to think about sort of each different asset at the very source level has a different business unit that it's associated with, but then as it starts to propagate through these analytical systems, it's often going to be enriched with or merged with or combined with in some fashion assets from the other organizations. And I'm wondering how you or some of your customers think about the way that that influences the ownership and the types of information that you want to maintain about sort of who owns the derived data asset. Is it a combination of all of the different business units where that, the BizOps person needs access to those sort of third level derived assets? Or is it something where they're primarily concerned with the source systems that people are trying to build analyses from?
I think teams are still figuring this out in some ways. I think the reality for most data teams today is that there isn't a clear structure in place saying, if this happens, this is who's going to own the data versus this. It does tend to be human driven, right? There's this one data engineer who's been in the company for like 5 years. And so he tends to be the person that everybody pings for like all of the issues, right? Like the reality is today, it is still a human problem. And, every team is very, very different. We're starting to see more approaches emerging. So, there are approaches of, how do you think about centralization versus decentralization? Can you think about hub and spoke models? I think there are more and more sort of approaches evolving, and we've seen all of them. So we've seen like a fully centralized data platform team that owns all of your business critical data. We've seen a fully decentralized model where, for example, you have data analysts in the marketing team who own all of the marketing data. And we've seen sort of approaches in the middle as well. I think what that translates to from a product perspective is we've realized, going back to that principle, right? Data teams are diverse, not just in the people, but also in the way that they're structured, which means that, we need to be able to support all of these structures, and also the fact that they will evolve over time. I don't expect our data teams to have this one fixed structure, because the reality is that all of these things are evolving over time, and you have to do what's best for the team and the company, and not just stick to like some governance model that was created by some management consultant that said this is how we should structure the ownership of our data assets, right? So yeah, I wish I had a more clear answer for this, but I think the reality is that most data teams are still figuring this out.
As people are starting to build out their platforms, they're looking for this sort of unifying layer to be able to gain visibility into their assets across the overall business and across their life cycles. What are the cases where Atlan is the wrong choice?
So a couple of different times when Atlan's the wrong choice. First, if on-prem is a part of your stack, we are not the right choice. We are fully cloud-first, cloud-native. We only support cloud-first, cloud-native choices. So if there's an on-prem component of the stack, we're just not the right fit. Another aspect is sometimes we see the starting point for these data discovery, metadata management kind of problems starting from compliance as a use case, right? So, engines to drive policy and compliance, and, that layer is what's driving a lot of this. Again, in that case as well, we are the wrong choice. We're built a lot more for the value side of things. How do you help your team collaborate and get the most value out of your data? And so I think those are the two choices where we would definitely be the wrong choice.
As you continue to iterate on the product and build out the business and learn more from the customers that you're working with, what are some of the plans that you have for the near to medium term?
I think we've still scratched the surface of what is really possible if you think about the future of collaboration. I think we have, still, I think as an industry, just started out on figuring out what collaboration really means in the data ecosystem. So the way we think about this, obviously from a product perspective, a lot more intelligence. This is actually a funny one, right? Like we're all data scientists and data practitioners. We spend our lives creating intelligence for business problems. But when it comes to like our own lives, there is almost close to nothing. So how do you create more intelligence? And the framework here that we've tried to do is, I know a lot of people have tried to say, we'll create this one overarching machine learning algorithm that solves for everything. Our approach on this is slightly different. We actually think that there will not be one overarching machine learning algorithm that just solves for context across all business use cases and teams and domains and industries. We actually think that again, going back to that concept of context, right? Context is going to be different in different use cases. And so our approach has been to almost make this a platform. So think of what Slack bots are in some ways. We've tried to bring that same ecosystem. How do you make it really, really easy for different teams to actually intelligence bots on top of Atlan for, basically classifying and tagging and organizing and building context on top of their data assets. Another, aspect to this is we're actually adding on like a layer of plugins to the ecosystem. So what that will allow teams to do is tomorrow, if there's a new data asset that they want to integrate Atlan into, right? Or tomorrow, if they want to build a custom workflow for the way that Atlan should work with their Jira or their ServiceNow or a custom Slack bot, we're actually opening, sort of like what NPM did for code sharing. We're opening that platform up, which basically then means, hopefully the community starts actually building out like a whole bunch of templates that can help other data teams around the world. So I think those are some of the things that we're going a lot deeper into in the short to mid-term.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Atlan or the overall space of data discovery and metadata management and sort of team unification in the data ecosystem that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think the only one thing that I think is important for teams to figure out is like the right timing. And also, I think the one mistake I've seen teams make is like investing too late. But the other mistake I've seen teams make is investing too early. So I think it's really important for data team leaders who realize the time that they're going to get to that inflection point and start investing in essentially tools to make your team more agile, maybe 3 to 6 months prior to that. So I think just the importance of timing in initiatives like this.
Well, for anybody who wants to follow along with the work that you're doing and get in touch, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I might be biased with this answer, devoting my life to solve hopefully one of these problems. I think two layers. One is definitely I see as the human collaboration layer. And I think that's really a user experience. Like, how do you bring principles of what Superhuman has done and Notion has done and Slack has done into the day-to-day lives of data practitioners? And the other, I touched on this briefly, is the intelligence layer. I think we all are great at applying intelligence to everything else except our own daily lives, hoping to see a lot more innovation, intelligence layer in data management.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at Atlan. It's definitely a very interesting project and something that is absolutely necessary to help more data teams be able to unify around the problems that they're trying to solve for and help the businesses that they're working in be able to realize more value from their data assets. So I appreciate all the time and energy that you've put into that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.